She leaned against my front door frame, arms crossed, and said it like she was doing me a favor. "You know, without me holding things together all those years, you'd have nothing. You know that, right?" And then she laughed. Not mean, exactly, just certain. The way you laugh at something obvious. That was 14 months ago, at our daughter's wedding rehearsal dinner. I drove home alone that night, past the Tim Hortons on the corner of Dunbar and 41st, past the park where I used to take our daughter on Sunday mornings when she was small enough to fit in the backpack carrier. I didn't say a word back to my ex-wife. I just nodded, smiled a little, and walked away to find my son-in-law's parents. I've thought about that moment more times than I care to admit. Not because it hurt. Well, it did. A little. The way a cold draft through a window you forgot to seal hurts, more surprising than painful. But because of how completely she believed it. There wasn't a single crack of doubt in her voice. After 31 years of marriage and 4 years of divorce, she still held the same story she'd been telling since the separation. That I was the one who coasted. That she was the engine. That without her organizing, her networking, her social calendar, and her connections, I would have drifted quietly into irrelevance. And the thing is, for a while I let myself believe some version of that too. When we separated, I was 62 years old. Our daughter had just finished her master's degree at UBC. The house in Carrisdale was going on the market. My ex-wife had a lawyer, a plan, and a very clear sense of what the next chapter of her life looked like. I had a storage unit in Burnaby, a 2-bedroom rental in East Van that smelled faintly of the previous tenant's cigarettes, and a retirement fund that had taken a significant hit in the settlement. I also had my work, though she'd never thought much of it. I'd spent most of my career as a structural engineer. Not glamorous, not the kind of job that comes up at dinner parties. I reviewed load calculations and site drainage plans and signed off on building permits for projects across the Lower Mainland. I worked quietly, billed honestly, showed up on time. My ex-wife had a gift for people, for rooms, for the kind of confidence that fills space and makes others lean in. She ran a small event planning company that did well because she did well. She was brilliant at it. Genuinely, I never disputed that. What I disputed, quietly and only to myself, was the idea that her brilliance had somehow been mine on loan. The rental in East Van turned out to be a gift, though I didn't see it that way at first. It was small enough that I couldn't hide in it. No den to retreat to, no garage to putter around in, just 2 rooms and a galley kitchen and a view of a back alley where the raccoons came every Tuesday night like they had a standing appointment. I started cooking properly for the first time in my adult life. I took long walks. I called my daughter more often and she called me back, which felt like something I hadn't earned yet, but was trying to. 3 months after moving in, my old colleague, a man I'd worked alongside for nearly 15 years before he retired, called me out of nowhere. He'd been approached to consult on a mid-scale mixed-use development in the Tri-Cities area. The developer was young, undercapitalized, and slightly over his head. My old colleague didn't want the job, but thought I might. "You got more patience than me," he said. "And you're not playing golf yet, are you?" I wasn't. I took the contract. Then another. Within 18 months of moving into that apartment in East Van, I had more consulting work than I'd had in the last decade of my full-time career. Part of it was timing. The Metro Vancouver construction market in those years was relentless, and experienced structural engineers who actually answered their phones were suddenly scarce. Part of it was that I was simply better at the work when I wasn't also managing a household that ran on tension. I didn't tell my ex-wife any of this. We communicated mostly through text messages about our daughter's wedding planning, logistics, guest lists, which hotel block to book for the out-of-town relatives. polite, functional, exactly what you'd expect from two people who had decided to be adults about things. She told people I was struggling, not viciously. I don't think she's a vicious person, but I heard through my daughter, who heard from a cousin, that my ex-wife had mentioned to a few mutual friends that she worried about me, that retirement hadn't gone the way I'd planned, that I was finding my footing. The phrase my daughter used when she told me, carefully watching my face for a reaction, was that her mother thought I seemed a bit lost. I didn't correct anyone. I know that frustrated my daughter. She's a direct person. She gets that from both of us, somehow, and she wanted me to defend myself, to set the record straight, to have some conversation with her mother that would reset the narrative. I understood why, but I also knew something that took me most of my 60s to learn. The people whose opinion of me actually mattered already knew the truth, and the ones who'd chosen to believe her version weren't really listening to begin with. My son-in-law is a good man, quiet, steady, works in municipal planning for the city of Coquitlam. He and my daughter bought a house in New Westminster the year after the wedding, a character home from the 1940s that needed work, the kind of place that looks romantic until you start finding out what the previous owners did to the plumbing. He called me one afternoon a few months after they moved in to ask if I could take a look at the foundation. Not professionally, just as his father-in-law who happened to know about these things. I went over on a Saturday. We spent most of the morning in the crawl space with headlamps, and then had lunch at the kitchen table while my daughter fed my grandson. Their first child had just turned 4 months old. He had his father's calm and his mother's eyes. I sat there holding him while my son-in-law made sandwiches, and I thought about how completely different my life looked from what anyone would have predicted 4 years earlier. That afternoon, my son-in-law asked how the consulting work was going. I told him honestly that the last quarter had been the strongest I'd had, that I'd just been brought onto a larger project near Port Moody, that I was thinking about taking on a junior partner to handle some of the drafting load. He nodded, then said quietly, "You know my mother-in-law thinks you're barely keeping afloat." Not accusatory, just something he wanted to put on the table between us, man to man. "I know," I said. "Does it bother you?" I thought about it genuinely, less than it used to. He nodded again. He's a man who understands the value of that kind of answer. The thing about building a quiet life is that nobody writes articles about it. There's no announcement, no moment where you turn to the room and say, "Look what I did while you weren't watching." Things just accumulate. The consulting work grew. I moved out of the East Van rental after 2 years and bought a small place in Port Moody, a townhouse, nothing dramatic, backing onto Shoreline Park. I could walk to the water in 8 minutes. I measured it. I did it almost every morning. I didn't buy it to prove anything. I bought it because I could, and because it was exactly the kind of place I would have wanted at 35 and never had the confidence to choose for myself. The first time my daughter saw it, she stood in the kitchen. It has good light in the afternoon. That kitchen, the kind that comes through west-facing windows and sits on the countertops like it's in no hurry, and she didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Dad, this is really nice," like she'd expected something apologetic, something provisional, and instead found something settled. I showed her the deck off the back. We watched a pair of herons pick their way along the creek that runs behind the property. My grandson was in the carrier on her chest, just awake, turning his head slowly toward the sound of the water. "You seem good," she said. "I am good," I said. That was true. It had been true for a while, but it was the first time I said it out loud with nothing underneath it. Several weeks after that visit, my daughter mentioned that her mother was going to be in Port Moody for a Saturday afternoon, some vendor meeting for an event at one of the Rocky Point venues. She'd mentioned wanting to see the baby. My daughter asked carefully if it would be all right if her mother came by the townhouse afterward, just briefly, so she could see her grandson in one place rather than doing two separate trips. I want to be clear about something. I didn't invite my ex-wife to come and prove a point. I know how that version of the story sounds, and I know it's the more satisfying version to tell. But the truth is, I said yes because it was convenient for my daughter, and because my grandson was 4 months old, and because I am 66 years old and I have no patience left for the performances that grudges require. She arrived mid-afternoon. I had made tea, a habit I'd picked up in those early rental years, loose leaf, a decent pot. My daughter was nursing in the back bedroom. My son-in-law was in the living room with the baby while I answered the door. My ex-wife looked well. She always looked well. She stepped inside and stopped in the entryway. She turned and looked at the living room, the kitchen beyond it, the afternoon light on the water through the back windows. She took in the deck, the trees, the clean lines of a space that had been chosen carefully and lived in properly. She said, "This is yours?" Not mean. Not anything really except surprised. The way you're surprised when a fact you'd filed away turns out to be different from the story you'd been keeping. "Yes," I said. She nodded slowly. My son-in-law came in from the living room with my grandson, who had decided he had opinions about the world and was beginning to express them at volume. The moment shifted, the way moments do when a baby enters them. My ex-wife reached for the baby and her face changed completely, that same transformation every grandparent knows, where everything else momentarily stops mattering. We had tea. We talked about the baby, about the new Westminster house, about whether my daughter's work schedule was going to adjust once mat leave ended. We were careful with each other, the way people are careful when they've decided that careful is better than whatever the alternative is. My ex-wife complimented the teapot. I told her where I'd found it, a shop on Hastings I'd been walking past for a year before finally going in. She laughed. I laughed a little too. She left after about an hour. My daughter walked her out to the car. I watched from the kitchen window as they stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes talking. I couldn't hear what they said. My son-in-law came up beside me with my grandson and stood there without saying anything, which I appreciated. My daughter came back in and started washing the teacups. She didn't say much at first. Then, with her back to me, she asked how long you'd lived here. What did you tell her? About 8 months. She paused. She seemed surprised. I didn't ask what the surprise meant. I didn't need to. Here's what I figured out at 66, which I probably could have figured out earlier if I'd been paying the right kind of attention. The story other people tell about you is theirs. It belongs to them. It was never really about you to begin with. My ex-wife's story about me, the one where I coasted, where I was carried, where I would have been nothing without her. That story was something she needed. I don't say that cruelly. I say it because I understand it now. When a marriage ends, especially one that long, both people scramble for a version of events that makes sense of what they're walking away from. Her version made her the indispensable one. She needed that. I understand it. What I couldn't do anymore was live inside her version, not for her comfort, not to keep the peace, not because changing the narrative might cause a scene. I didn't blow anything up either. I didn't take her to task. I didn't list the consulting contracts or point to the view from the back deck or say anything even slightly resembling "I told you so." That's not the same as being passive. That's just understanding that the proof was already there, had been there for a while, and the only thing left was deciding who it needed to be for. It needed to be for my daughter. It needed to be for my grandson. It needed to be for the man I became in the 2 rooms in East Van where I started cooking and taking long walks and answering my phone. My ex-wife called my daughter that evening, apparently. My daughter mentioned it to me the following week, casually, the way she mentions things she wants me to hear but doesn't want to make a thing of. She said her mother had said I seemed well, that I seemed settled, that the place was lovely. That was it, no more than that. But I'd been waiting, without knowing I was waiting, for someone who had written that story about me to pick up their pen and quietly, without ceremony, change a word or two. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't vindication. Not in the way movies make you expect vindication to feel. It was smaller than that, and I think more real. The kind of thing that settles into you on a Tuesday morning while you're walking the 8 minutes down to the water, watching the herons, hands in your jacket pockets, not in any particular hurry. I didn't need her to know she'd been wrong. I only needed to stop carrying her certainty for her. That part, the putting it down, the walking away lighter, that part was mine all along. There's a particular kind of afternoon light in Port Moody that comes through west-facing windows and just sits there. Doesn't rush, doesn't ask anything of you. I notice it most when I'm making tea, which I do slowly now, the way I do most things. I've thought a lot about what actually happened over those 4 years. Not the dramatic version, not the version where I became someone unrecognizable, but the quiet, unglamorous version where I simply kept showing up, paid my bills, answered my phone, walked down to the water when I needed to think. What I've come to understand is that the outcome wasn't luck and it wasn't spite. It was the natural result of a particular set of choices made consistently, without an audience, without applause. My ex-wife believed her own story about me, and for a while, that story had some purchase on me too. That's the honest truth. When someone who knew you for 31 years says you were carried, some part of you wonders if they're right. The wondering isn't weakness. The wondering is what an honest person does. What matters is what you do with it, whether you let it settle into you as fact, or whether you take it apart carefully and decide what's actually true. What I found when I looked carefully was that I had always done the work. I had always been decent. I had never taken shortcuts that cost other people. Those aren't small things. I'd undervalued them for years because they don't photograph well, don't make for interesting dinner conversation, but they compound, the way interest compounds. Quietly, over time in a direction you don't always see until you step back. The consulting work didn't appear out of nowhere. It came because I'd spent decades being the kind of engineer other engineers trusted, not flashy, not self-promotional, just thorough and honest and available. My old colleague called me because he knew what I was. He'd watched me work for 15 years. That's cause and effect, plain and simple. The reputation I'd built, one honest report at a time, eventually came back around. The harder thing, the thing that took longer, was learning to hold my own judgment with more weight than someone else's. That's not arrogance. Arrogance is dismissing other views without examination. What I'm talking about is the willingness to do the examination honestly and then trust what you find. My ex-wife's certainty about me was not evidence. Her confidence in her own narrative was not proof. I had to learn the difference between a loud opinion and an accurate one. That took time. That took the kind of clear thinking that's only available when you stop defending yourself long enough to actually look. And the perseverance. The getting up in a small apartment in East Van and making another cup of coffee and calling another client and walking another kilometer along another trail. That wasn't heroic. It was just the refusal to stop. There's nothing elegant about it. You just don't stop. You let days accumulate. You trust that the work has weight even when no one is watching it, even when the story being told about you in other rooms is a different story entirely. My grandson doesn't know any of this yet. He's too young. But one day he'll be old enough to hear it, and what I want him to understand is not that his grandfather triumphed or proved someone wrong or won anything. I want him to understand that I kept my word to myself, that I stayed honest when it would have been easier not to, that I kept working when the work felt thankless, that I trusted my own reading of my own life, eventually, when it mattered. The light through those west-facing windows, it was always going to be there. I just had to be the kind of person who would stop long enough to notice it